morning, buenos dias. My name is Frances Contreras. I'm Dean of the School of Education here at UC Irvine. Thank you for attending today's webinar and talk titled Bien Educado, Raising Latine Children to Thrive. As we celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month and the accomplishments and achievements of the Latino community, it's equally important to acknowledge that we are guests on native land. So I wanted to start with the UCI unofficial land acknowledgement. We're still working on that official land acknowledgement. The University of California Irvine campus is located on the homelands of the Ashaman and Tongva peoples who, in the face of ongoing settler colonialism, continue to claim their place and act as stewards of their ancestral lands as they have for the past 8,000 years. We recognize and respect that the UCI School of Education is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Ashaman and Tongva peoples. This region extends from Santa Ana River to Aliso Creek and beyond. As a land-grant institution, we acknowledge the Ashaman and Tongva people as traditional land caretakers whose efforts to steward and protect the land continue today. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that brings us here today. Now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Gustavo Carlo, and our moderator, Dr. Adriana Villavicencio. Dr. Gus Carlo is professor in the School of Education at UC Irvine. His primary research interests focus on understanding positive social development and health in culturally diverse children and adolescents. Many of his projects focus on ethnic racial groups across the world and in the United States Latino, Latina, Latinx youth and families. He has published over 250 books, chapters, and research papers. He has received funding from various agencies, including NSF, NIH, several foundations, and has received several awards for his research and mentorship, including the LEAD Award here at UCI for Outstanding Faculty Mentor. Recently, the Journal of Cognitive Sciences and Human Development named Dr. Gustavo Carlo the #1 most prolific author in prosocial behavior research in the world. Welcome, Gus. He currently, and then Dr. Adriana Villavicencio, our moderator. She is an assistant professor here at UC Irvine. Her research is focused on K-12 educational policy and school practice that deepen or disrupt inequities for minoritized communities of students and families. Dr. Villavicencio's work includes studies on turnaround middle schools, small high schools, schools serving newly arrived immigrant English learners, and a racial justice program embedded in culturally diverse elementary schools. Her book, that has won numerous awards, Am I My Brother's Keeper? Educational Opportunities and Outcomes for Black and Brown Boys, was published by Harvard Education Press. This book examines how districts and schools can embed racial equity into sustainable policies and practices in contrast to initiatives that come and go. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Adriana Villavicencio. She will follow the presentation next by Dr. Gustavo Carlo. Thank you.
Okay, testing, make sure that it works. I think it's working. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Dean Contreras. And thank you all for being here today. I am honored and it's a pleasure to be the speaker for Hispanic Heritage Month on behalf of the School of Education here at UCI. Before I get started, I'd like to also take a moment to acknowledge and sort of dedicate this presentation to the millions of children around the world who are suffering and families who are suffering at the borders and these wars in the Ukraine and in Israel. It's terribly saddening to see how we still live in times of conflict and much suffering at the hands of innocent people. So with that being said, today I'm going to talk about some of the work that we've been doing over the past 30 years or so, particularly focused on Latine, Latinx, Latino, Latina, youth and families. And I'm going to focus a lot of my talk today on positive aspects and cultural strengths and cultural assets that are inherent in traditional Latina culture. The title of my talk is Bien Educado, Raising Latina Children to Thrive. Starting out with some numbers, it's a good place to start, I think, always. Acknowledging the fact that, number one, Latinas are now the largest ethnic racial minority group in the US, and they will continue to be so for many, many years to come. We have a number of Latina children in our school systems across the country. But we also have a number, substantial percentage of Latino children and youth that are at risk for academic dropout and underperformance. We have a substantial number of them that still do not have easy access to a college education and to graduating from college. And of course, the challenges and the demands on our children and our communities are multiple. And so there is no simple solution to addressing these challenges, certainly not in the near future. It's important to acknowledge also that part of the challenge has to do with the fact that, first of all children are at risk, no matter what backgrounds they come from. But minority and immigrant children often have added and sometimes unique risks associated with their status in our society. A major proportion of the explanation for the challenges and risks have to do with the fact that a substantial percentage of our minority populations live in poverty, and that has all kinds of consequences that are also associated with risks, such as attendance in low-quality schools or schools that are under-resourced, living and residing in unsafe neighborhoods, living and residing and attending schools that are where they are exposed to high levels of toxicants and pollutants. And all of these things can also cause stress in the families and expose our children to family conflict and chaos. And then, of course, there's the issue of immigration status and the fact that many families are struggling to access the rights and privileges of all children in the US, and other sort of trauma exposures that could be related to being a person of ethnic or racial minority status. And of course, we have to highlight one of those particular risks that have to do with ethnic racial minority status, and that has to do with the discrimination, both at the systemic level, embedded in systems that have been created in ways that pose challenges for persons that come from other societies and other cultures that might have different values and different sorts of traditions. And then, of course, discrimination at the interpersonal and at the intergroup level. So I usually like to start out the talk about my work by giving you a very short, don't worry, I'm not going to give you my whole childhood background history, but a little story about this notion that we call bien educado. And it is something that was ingrained in my head early on, mostly from my mother's, because I spent so much time being raised by my mother, who kept telling me that, and insisting and lecturing me on the importance of growing up to be un niño bien educado. Now, at first glance, the term bien educado literally mean, if you put it in Google Translate, it'll say well-educated, right? Formal, and it insinuates a formal education. but it actually has relatively little to do with getting a formal education. It actually has a lot more to do with being a person of good moral character, being a person with good manners, displaying good manners, being respectful and considerate of others, being kind and caring to others. And this notion of bien educado is not unique to Latina cultures. There are other cultures that have similar concepts and similar values. But it is a very common and very traditional value that's highly espoused in many, not all, but many Latina families and cultures and societies. Well, this notion of bien educado turns out to be really fascinating, at least in my own nerdy sort of way. I find it very fascinating. But hopefully I will demonstrate that it's also important. It's an important concept, and it has important repercussions and consequences for how our Latina children end up and their chances of success and thriving in our communities. As a nerdy sort of researcher, we have to operationalize the concepts that we're interested in trying to understand. And it turns out that there's nice existing literature out there on this concept that is termed by scientists, by social scientists, as prosocial behaviors. And prosocial behaviors are simply actions that benefit other people. These are very common, everyday kinds of behaviors that we often see on a day-to-day basis. It involves sharing with others, being kind to others, helping other people, comforting other people. It could become very structured and very formal in the sense of volunteerism activities. But all of those kinds of behaviors are with this orientation towards benefiting other people. It is a very broad rubric, very broad umbrella of behaviors and actions. And it's actually pretty complicated because, of course, nothing is simple in our world. Because, for example, we have prosocial behaviors that are sometimes enacted for one's own benefit. So they may be egoistically motivated. Sometimes we might do something nice because we expect to get something in return from that other person. Or sometimes we do something nice because we want to gain their approval or perhaps gain their trust and so that we can later on manipulate them and take advantage of them. So we need to be careful because on the surface, prosocial behaviors may look good and desirable, but sometimes there might be some other less desirable motives behind it. These behaviors are also engaged towards different targets, towards different groups of people. And so you can imagine how some of us may have certain biases in terms of helping people that we deem to be part of our in-group, but we might also have some other people that have a tendency to engage in these behaviors no matter who the target is. So they may be towards out-group members. Under this broad rubric of prosocial behaviors, there's a special set of prosocial behaviors that we call altruistic prosocial behaviors. And these are the selflessly motivated forms of prosocial behaviors. These are behaviors that we enact with the primary intention to benefit others. Even if we get something in return that's positive, that was not really our primary intention. So we do these things with little or no expectation for self-rewards. At the extreme end of these behaviors, you can imagine things like putting yourself at risk, your life at risk, to rescue someone from immediate danger, a fire or a flood or earthquake or World Trade Center bombing. But it doesn't always necessarily have to be that sort of extreme kind of altruistic action. And therefore, these actions are actually much more common than we might initially believe. Now, why am I telling you about prosocial behaviors? Why am I telling you about this notion of bien educado? What does this have to do with education? I'll get to that in a moment. But I want to take a little time to reflect on the importance of this construct. Why should we care about prosocial behaviors? Well, first of all, it is a marker of morality. It's a marker of the moral standing and the moral development of persons, of our kids, of our teachers, of our parents, of our politicians, policymakers, etc. Secondly, very importantly, it's the kinds of actions that actually directly reduce social injustices. There's many social injustices that our Latine families and children are facing require that others engage in these forms of prosocial behaviors, and that they are willing to do so towards minority groups, families, and children, towards those that may be most vulnerable and most prone to risk or maladjustment and negative health outcomes. Third, this is particularly obvious in light of conflicts that we are seeing nowadays. These are the kinds of actions that actually can counter violence, can counter conflict, and can foster harmony, group harmony, intergroup harmony, and very importantly for Latine families and youth, social integration, successful integration into our communities, into our schools. Secondly, these behaviors are really important because, let's face it, this is what we desire. This is what, if you ask parents what are the qualities that they would most like to see in their own children, I'm not a betting person, but if I were to bet, I would bet that these prosocial qualities would be right up there, near the top or at the top. Most parents, most people want to see other people treat them nicely and with kindness and with compassion and caring, right? Our communities and our societies care about these actions because these actions are directly related to cooperative behaviors. So how do we succeed as a community? How do we succeed as a school? It requires cooperation, and that means it requires that people are willing to engage in prosocial behaviors with each other. And it's also directly related to civic engagement. So again, we want to change our laws, we want to change the politics, our environments, our school policies, et cetera, then we need people to be civically engaged, to have that sense of responsibility, to want to have a positive impact on their environment and on the persons in their environment. Third, it turns out that now we have quite substantive evidence that even if you don't care about morality, even if you don't care about cooperation and global peace and harmony, it turns out that these behaviors are also a marker of health and well-being. In and of themselves, they are negatively related to all kinds of maladjustment indicators, things like mental illness, pathology. It's negatively related to violence. It's negatively related to drug use. It's negatively related to a whole host of negative markers and indicators of maladjustment. So if nothing else, if we care about the health of our children in our schools, if we care about the health of our communities, we ought to think about assessing the extent to which children are expressing and exhibiting these prosocial behaviors. And then, of course, very importantly, last but not least, it's positively related to a number of other positive markers of development and health and well-being. including things like self-esteem. Kids who are very prosocial tend to have higher self-esteem, higher academic self-efficacy. I will show and demonstrate that later. Better and more improved positive interpersonal relationships. If we think about how is it that we normally develop a new friendship with someone, it's on the basis of doing something nice or saying something nice to that person. And then that person hopefully will reciprocate and say something nice to you, right? And over time, if you have these prosocial exchanges and experiences, that will often develop into a friendship, and perhaps even more than a friendship, a romantic relationship. If we wanted to get a good marker of marital satisfaction, probably not a bad idea to ask about how many prosocial behaviors do you guys engage in between yourselves, right? And then it turns out that prosocial kids also do better in school. And there's lots of really great ideas about why that is. Perhaps you're probably already imagining some of those ideas yourself. I will talk a little more about that later on as well. But kids who are prosocial tend to do better in school, period. Academic performance, grades, standardized tests, all kinds of academic outcomes. So it's something that we perhaps should pay a little more attention to in our schools, in our school systems, and perhaps in our homes to give our kids a better chance to thrive in our schools. All right. So I'm not going to throw a whole bunch of nerdy stat numbers and all that kind of stuff. That stuff sometimes bores me as well. But I wanted to throw some of our results from some of our studies just to give you a little teaser of some of the stuff that we do. And I'd like to start out with this one because this is a study that demonstrates the protective effects of prosocial behaviors for kids who engage in high levels of prosocial behaviors. And hopefully you can see from this diagram that when we measure the amount or the exposure to discrimination experiences, and these are, by the way, are recently immigrated Latine adolescents. So they had immigrated to the US within the last 5 years, very recent immigrants. Their reports of those who reported high levels of discrimination were less likely, on the bottom side of it, I don't know if there's a pointer here, but I'm afraid to use it. On the bottom side, you can see that there's a negative path from discrimination to altruistic prosocial behaviors. And again, those are the selflessly motivated forms of prosocial behaviors. So those kids who experience more discrimination are less likely to engage in altruistic behaviors, that is, take the risk and help people without getting something for themselves. But they are more likely to engage in this other kind of prosocial behavior, which is called public. And public prosocial behaviors is actually an egoistic form of prosocial behavior. Those are prosocial behaviors that kids engage in front of an audience, and oftentimes they're motivated to engage in those behaviors because they're trying to gain the approval of others, or they're trying to elevate their social status, okay? But it's not really for the benefit of others, it's really for their own benefit. And then, really importantly, you can see that those kids that actually engage in high levels of altruistic prosocial behaviors are less likely to show depressive symptoms later. This is a longitudinal study. We also found support for the reverse causal model, such that those that were exposed to high levels of discrimination showed more depressive symptoms, and those kids that showed more depressive symptoms were less likely to show high levels of altruistic prosocial behaviors. Now, why is this all important? Well, It's important for several reasons, but obviously one important reason is, as I said earlier, if we're going to successfully integrate our children into our school systems, then everyone needs to engage in prosocial behaviors. And they need to be willing to do so in spite of whatever costs there might be to themselves. In other words, we can't afford to contribute to the marginalization and isolation and the segregation of Latine kids in our schools if they are only in it for themselves, right? And from the other side of it, those who are in position of privilege need to be willing to engage in the altruistic prosocial behaviors. They need to be willing to engage in helping Latine kids, even if they get nothing in return for doing so. Takes two, right? Both sides. But we can see that altruism, in this case, serves as a protective factor for the kids from exhibiting higher levels of depressive symptoms. And that's really important too. Obviously, if our kids are not mentally healthy, they're not going to do very well in school. Here's another example of the protective effects of prosocial behaviors. In this case, demonstrating how those Latine kids who demonstrate high levels of altruistic and compliant behaviors, prosocial behaviors. That compliant is when somebody asks you to help, are you willing to help them? They're less likely to affiliate with deviant peers. And of course, deviant peer affiliation is a strong predictor of aggression and delinquency. So hopefully you start to get a sense of the jigsaw puzzle that we're putting together here. Yes, it's important to teach our kids arithmetic. It's important to teach them how to read and literacy and all of these important school skills. But we also need to pay attention to the mental health and the behavioral health of our children in order for our children to have a chance to succeed. This one is to show you kind of the flip side of it. In this case, you can see that Latine kids who have a bicultural identity, so bicultural identity, that's one form of ethnic identity. It's basically, these are kids who are not just adopting US cultural values and norms, but they're also retaining their native ethnic heritage, right? So they're trying to navigate, think about how Latine kids have to navigate these two cultural worlds, right? When they immigrate or when their families immigrate to the US, they have to navigate these two cultural worlds. Bicultural identity kids are kids that are trying to do so and while still retaining that strong ethnic heritage. Well, it turns out that those kids show higher levels of prosocial behaviors. And when they show high levels of prosocial behaviors, that predicts higher levels of self-esteem and general self-efficacy, more self-confidence. Okay. So this is like a mishmash kind of thing of other research. Just very quickly, want to make sure that we understand that prosocial behaviors are linked to a number of social cognitive skills, like they're better at understanding the situation of others, they engage in higher level moral reasoning, thinking about moral dilemmas, they have more positive self-concept and efficacy. They also prosocial behaviors are linked to better social emotional skills, such as easy temperament, including more positive emotions, higher levels of empathy and sympathy, which of course predict prosocial behaviors, higher levels of forgiveness and gratitude, and actually even higher levels of guilt and shame. And there are also kids that demonstrate better ability to cope with stress and to regulate their emotions and their cognitions. And we know self-regulation is a strong predictor of better academic outcomes as well. If we wanted to look at ecological factors, and again, I don't have time to bore you with everything, so this is a rush through. But we know some things like, for example, more positive physical environments. Obviously, the more positive the school environments are, then the better it enhances and facilitates the expression of prosocial behaviors between students, between teachers, between students and teachers, staff, and so on. So examples of this are low levels of conflict is associated with more prosocial behaviors. Adult supervised community agencies, structured agencies, like, for example, structured after-school programs. We have a great colleague in our school that does a lot of great work on after-school programs. Those are fantastic because they provide opportunities, adult supervised, structured opportunities for the kids to continue to develop their social, emotional, and social interaction skills. Sports, by the way, there's work on team sports. If it's done correctly, in a positive manner, that can promote and facilitate prosocial behaviors. In terms of socialization agents, obviously our media is important. The media that we as parents choose to expose our children to makes a difference. There's a reason why production companies, movie production companies, commercial companies, they invest billions of dollars into marketing and everything because they know that that exposure, those products that they produce, actually has an impact on human behaviors. So don't believe any of the stuff out there about, oh, exposing my kids to this violent stuff isn't going to have a negative impact on them. It might not have a negative impact, but why take the risk? Why take the risk when we know that in general, those things do have a negative impact on children? Caring teachers, obviously, that's really important. That entails ensuring that our teachers are well supported, that they are not subjected to burnout and to callous sort of authentically motivated teachers that want to help the students. And then, of course, affiliation with prosocial peers, with other peers that are engaged in prosocial behaviors. And then in the home environment, warmth, secure attachment, disciplining practices that avoids the use of physical corporal punishment and harsh parenting. And then exposure to what we call prosocial parenting practices, which are things like rewarding your child when they do good things, acknowledging when they do good things. One thing that's really interesting from this work is that we find that the use of material rewards, like giving them a gift, that actually is not effective in promoting prosocial behaviors. It's much more effective to just show social approval or show them more love, more affection. The social rewards are much more important than material rewards. All right, so then speaking of parents and families, I wanted to demonstrate some of the work that we've done looking at how we raise Latine kids to be bien educado. This is a pretty simple, straightforward study demonstrating how parents who are much more supportive of their children, that warmth, that nurturance fosters more empathy in the children. That fosters also higher level moral reasoning, and ultimately that fosters altruistic prosocial behaviors. And that, by the way, applies to not only Latino families, but also white European American families, all families. Oh, here's the work on the social rewards. So I was just talking about how social rewards is much more effective in promoting empathy and moral reasoning and helping. And in fact, material rewards actually it's not associated with empathy, so it doesn't foster their empathy, and it actually undermines their moral reasoning. This is something, by the way, also that can be transferred into the school and classroom environment. right? So something to think about. Do we give some sort of privilege or gifts to kids who are behaving well and doing well in school? Or do we find other sort of more qualitative ways of acknowledging and encouraging those kids? Now, when it comes to Latine kids in our society, they are also said they're navigating two cultural worlds, and that process of navigating those two cultural worlds entails two processes that are co-occurring. One is acculturation, where they're learning about their new culture and their new environment. And most of that learning comes from their peers, from the media, from majority culture adults like teachers in the schools and whatnot. And then the other aspect is the enculturation that is happening to these kids. And there, the primary responsibility lies in the family to teach their children about their native culture, to feel proud about their ethnic native culture, to teach them about things like familismo or familism, their duty and obligation to the family, which, by the way, is very, very important for fostering prosocial behaviors. This sort of serves as the training grounds for fostering prosocial behaviors, because that's one of the first times where kids are encouraged to think of other people besides themselves, other people, other members of their family. And then they learn other cultural values. What are some of those cultural values? Well, first of all, in many Latin American countries and many Latine families, the socialization, the orientation is towards the group, towards the broader group. We call that collectivism, we call that communalism. Many Latine families, not all, of course, are also very religious, and especially Christian Catholic beliefs, which have very strong messages about teachings of forgiveness and the Good Samaritan story and all of these sort of beliefs and principles about helping others. The cultural value of respeto or respect, for especially towards elders, towards authority figures. And then this notion of bien educado that I already mentioned. If you notice, all of these cultural values have this sort of other orientation. So these are things that where Latine children are being taught to think of other people, again, besides themselves. So inherently, these are really prosocial kinds of values. There are two other important cultural mechanisms that are also inherently prosocial. One is familismo, which I've already mentioned. That has to do with the extent to which the Latine children identify with their family unit. It also has to do with how much support they provide to the family and how much support they expect from the family towards each other. And then this duty or obligation to the family. And then a second important mechanism is one that I mentioned already. It's the bicultural identity and the ethnic identity. And this has to do with the extent to which they actually identify with their ethnic heritage and they're proud of their ethnic heritage. Turns out that these two mechanisms have been the most researched mechanisms in the literature, and they've been directly linked to better educational outcomes, improved mental health, reduced problem behaviors, as well as more prosocial behaviors. How are these things transmitted to Latino kids? Well, in one study, and we have a couple of other studies like this, we demonstrate that when the mothers, for example, in this study, report high levels of familismo values, that they endorse familismo values, they are more likely to engage in practices that transmit this familismo value, practices such as assigning the kids to take care of their younger siblings, assigning them and expecting them to help out around the house. Those are all very important messages that say, hey, the family is really important. You know, you want to go play out play with your friends or whatever, but you have chores to do at home, or you have to come to dinner, or you have to go to your grandmother's birthday party or whatever, right? So those that engage in more of those kinds of parenting practices, well, it turns out the kids pick up on those parenting practices. So when the kids pick up that their mothers are engaging in those parenting practices, they themselves turn out to more strongly endorse this familism value. And then the familism value in turn predicts more prosocial behaviors. So you can see the full gamut of what we think of as a cultural values transmission model, where it starts from what are the beliefs and the values of the mothers, in this case, the practices that they engage in that transmit those values and beliefs, how the children pick up on those values and beliefs through the practices that they're exposed to, and then how they themselves adopt and internalize those values, and ultimately how those values influence how they behave towards others. I'm just about to wrap up, so I have no idea where I'm at time-wise. But one last study. This one I'm very proud of because we started out with looking at the parenting practices of the parents, in this case, what we call authoritative parents. So these are parents who show high levels of support and warmth to their children, but they are also firm and demanding. Now, of course, they're not overly demanding, they're not harsh, they don't engage in corporal punishment, so it's a moderate level of firmness and demandingness. They have some rules, they're clear about those rules, but they don't go overboard and exert any sort of harsh or physical practices to enforce those rules. Turns out that those parents, Latine parents, have kids that engage in more prosocial behaviors. And again, this is longitudinal study. And their prosocial behaviors at an earlier time point predicts later, higher levels of academic self-efficacy. So they have more confidence in school. And then it turns out that more confidence in school subjects predicts positively higher grades, both self-reports as well as teacher reports. And of course, this work on self-efficacy, we have another great colleague in our department. I always like to plug my colleagues because we have such great colleagues. But Jackie Eccles, who's a distinguished professor who has done so much work in this area of motivation, school motivation. This fits very nicely with her work. I always like to see that. So I'll wrap this up by giving you this little simple recipe for how do we foster a healthy, bien educado Latine kid. You can start with a good dose of traditional Latine cultural values. Things like familismo, respeto. Let's teach our kids these good moral values. Let's teach them, let's try to encourage them to become bien educado kids. Add a couple tablespoons or so. You may have to add a little more, reduce it a little bit. Of ethnic identity, make them feel proud of their native heritage. A little bit of encouragement about expressing their sadness, their feelings, their concern for those who are needy, for those who are vulnerable, less privileged. A little bit of moral reasoning. Give them some principles, some values that they can help to strengthen their sympathy for others, right? Give them a few little tidbits like, we should do whatever we can to reduce human suffering. Something as simple as that. Mix all that in a supportive household, family household, with minimal family conflict, a healthy amount of parental warmth, some inductive discipline, that is, alternatives to corporal punishment and harsh punishment. Some of these prosocial parenting practices, like acknowledging when they are doing good things, show them a little more love. Then transfer this child into a supportive school environment, an open and embracing school environment, and a school environment that will accept them for their native ethnic heritage, for their bien educado characteristics. And a school environment that will continue to reinforce and foster those bien educado qualities. An inclusive community, cover, let simmer for a few years, and then serve at room temperature and enjoy. So, enculturative practices foster cultural assets and strengths. And by the way, it's clear that these cultural assets are truly assets. In fact, we know that Latine kids who reject their ethnic identity are much more prone to exhibiting negative maladjustment outcomes, exhibiting higher levels of mental health problems, higher levels of delinquency, and so on and so forth. So this is a good thing. Don't let anyone else tell you otherwise. Let's focus on prosocial behaviors. It's important because it's also a way of redressing and counteracting all the negative stereotypes and the stigmas associated with being a person of color in this country. When we highlight our strengths and our assets and what we contribute, the ways that the majority of us can contribute to this country, we can do a lot to counteract all those other messages that are out there in the media and so on and so forth that really negatively stereotype and stigmatize ourselves, our communities. It's also important for informing the development of positive intervention programs. It's not just about reducing negative problems, as I sort of refer to it sometimes as the couch potato syndrome. Hypothetically speaking, if we could extract all the negative things outside, out of our brains, what child would we be left with? A child that sits there on a couch, does nothing? No, we want our children to thrive. We want them to reach their maximum, right? So we need to also develop these programs that foster all these positive qualities in our children, not just eliminate or reduce the negative stuff. We need policies and intervention programs at different multiple levels of intervention, to policies and laws that actually embrace and support and reinforce the all the richness that we have to offer. These interventions will lead to programs that not only reduce maladaptation, but foster and focus on enhancing well-being and health. And I wanted to give you a very small example of some work that we're currently doing in collaboration with one of my graduate students, Maritza Torres, and with Dr. June An. We're developing an intervention program. It's actually a card game that we're hoping to be able to use with migrant children who are in detention centers, who are not really getting very strong, they're not residing in a very stimulating environment. Because we know from other work that we can actually do things through intervention that can actually foster and enhance these prosocial behaviors in our kids. I want to acknowledge all the great colleagues and my students and my labs across these years that have helped me to send this message out to many people around the world. And that is my contact information. And I believe now my colleague comes up here for...
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me be here in this role. Of course, Gus is a great friend, but you've reminded us all of what a great scholar you are and a contributor to the field. And I also want to appreciate some of the words, this talk in particular, given the conflicts that we're seeing in the world today. So I want to ask somewhat of a maybe challenging question, which is not super pro-social of me. But I am wondering, I mean, obviously you've really built a case for the positive links between pro-social behavior and individual outcomes at the community level, society. But in your research, or even in terms of how you think about it, are there ever any trade-offs? Can pro-social behavior, a priority of cooperation, harmony, ever present important trade-offs in terms of perhaps perpetuating social injustice sometimes? I think there was your first slide said that 79% of students cut off education to support their families, for example. So there's an example of a trade-off. So I'm just curious what you would say to that.
Yeah, no, excellent question. It's absolutely true that, as with anything, there's no simple solutions. There's always trade-offs. There's no perfect, panacea sort of, kind of pro-social behavior that will solve all problems. Because, these behaviors are immersed in the real world, which is, again, as I said earlier in the talk, is a very complex world and environment, and things are constantly changing. And so what we deem to be, pro-social or moral at one time point can change over time. It can be different across different cultures. So I think, as always, these things need to be taken, with a grain of salt. We need to be thoughtful about, for example, if we develop intervention programs, we need to be thoughtful about, who's going to benefit the most from it, who might be shortchanged, how those programs can really, are there going to be groups or persons that might be, left out from the benefits of the program? I think this is just a reality of really almost everything that we do and everything that we engage in. A lot of the work that we do is based on probabilities. So even, for example, when I say things like, try not to use physical punishment or corporal punishment, it's not to say that your kid's going to turn out to be a serial killer if you do. But as I sort of alluded to earlier, it's all part of this larger, I don't know, there's so many metaphors, jigsaw puzzle, right? So the more of these positive pieces we surround our children with, I think the better the chances that our kids will benefit from the interventions that we develop, right? And it's always much better to have and develop these policies and interventions, based on data rather than just personal anecdotes or, like even my own personal anecdote about Bien Educado. If it were just me, I wouldn't be talking about it, right? But what's fascinating to me is how many people relate to that story, to relate to that concept. And so that gives me a little more confidence that there's something about that. But again, it's not the answer to everything. And we have to be humble and understand that. And but having said all that, so often we've developed programs and we're putting our kids in environments that have either not thought about these issues very well, or we're afraid to change those systems and those existing structures, because perhaps some people are unwilling to give up how they benefit from the existing structure in the system, right? So, yeah, there are trade-offs. Familismo is one of those things. I don't know if anyone's ever seen the movie Real Women Have Curves. It's a fantastic movie with America Ferrera. I plug her because she's one of my favorite actresses. But the story is really powerful. She plays a young Latina adolescent who has the promise of going to college and attending college, but her family wants her to stay home and work in the home business. And so she's torn, right? And especially, anyway. And so it plays out very powerfully, right? And that's sometimes a very tough decision that our children have to make, or that persons have to make. However, I would still argue that familismo in general is still a very positive cultural value. And even if it doesn't always lead to easy solutions.
I know we're short on time, so I'm going to try to combine some of the questions from the web. So you talked a lot about family practices, which as a mom of two, I really appreciate it. I'm going to look up more of your papers. But from the school, I was a teacher as well. So from a teacher perspective, this person online was asking about after school programs in particular. I think there's a lot of potential for effective interventions there. But from the school, after school program perspective, what are some kind of practical strategies that you've seen in your research or that you theorize might be the most effective for young people to develop some of these characteristics?
Yeah, really excellent, another excellent question. Well, after school programs are not my area of expertise. Where's Dr. Simpkins when I need her? But I from reading the work of other colleagues in the prosocial development literature, there's a few things I guess I would point out that I've learned from reading their work. One is that, and this actually applies to schools as well. So Nell Nodding's work on caring environments or caring schools, caring classrooms is a great example. So if we could structure those after-school programs so that the kids are encouraged to engage with a diverse group of students and do so cooperatively, engaged in some sort of activities that require cooperative behaviors and interactions, so that whatever they're doing, they enjoy it more, and they can sort of hopefully foster some empathy between the different mixed peer groups. That's one thing. The other thing that I mentioned during the talk is that I think everything is relative, and so we know from the sociological literature, for example, that a big problem is that if we don't offer after-school extracurricular activities to our kids, then many of our kids are, pretty prone to engaging in activities that are not supervised by adults, right, or unstructured activities. There's some really fascinating work by a colleague at Rutgers, Dan Hart and his colleagues, that show that kids who grow up in what they call youth bulges, those are neighborhoods and environments where the kids outnumber the adults, that those kids are more prone to antisocial behaviors and less prone to prosocial behaviors. So I think, ensuring that we have adequate supervision of kids and that we do what we can to encourage and foster cooperative behaviors during those after-school activities. I think those are just a couple of things that I can think of off the top of my head.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, let's take one question. I think we have time for one. From anyone here.
So I was thinking about the pandemic and how we were working with some large school districts in the greater Los Angeles area during the pandemic. And when school shut down, what we first saw was a lot of disengagement and kids being depressed and whatever. And everyone was so excited when they came back that there would be this great spirit of community. But in these particular school districts, we got reports of a lot of antisocial behavior, kids acting out and being very aggressive. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that. And they seem to be recovering from the whole thing more slowly than certain other areas. And it seems like there's a link to the prosocial behavior. I wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I thought a lot. The pandemic really concerned me deeply in so many ways because, you know, sort of as I talk about what are the conditions that foster prosociality, a basic fundamental assumption is that we have the opportunities to interact with each other. And I really am a strong believer that in-person interactions, social interactions, is much more impactful than virtual interactions. So I actually wrote an editorial piece, wasn't published, of course. I sent it to New York Times. I thought, well, maybe, because I was really wanted to highlight the impact that I think the undermining impact that the pandemic was having on our kids' abilities to develop empathy with each other, which is, I think, very fundamental and basic for prosociality. We need to be able to understand each other, and there are too many layers and barriers with virtual interactions as opposed to social interactions. I think even if you foster empathy virtually with others, it's not at the same level or the same quality as fostering empathy in person with in-person interactions. And so I think a lot of these problems that we're seeing, that we saw and that we're still recovering from are, I mean, there's probably other reasons, of course, because I'm not an expert on this, but at least twofold. One is the fact that prosociality really, especially in the school systems and school settings, you know, it's almost like it takes a village. You need to build that community. And I think the pandemic made it very difficult for those schools to build that community of investment in each other and in, identity with each other, that they are part of a real, important community. I think virtual interactions just make it very, very difficult for that group building, that community building aspect. The other important aspect that cannot be overlooked and can't be understated or overstated is the mental health consequences. I think the pandemic was a trauma experience for all of us. And I think, as I demonstrated in some of our studies, when kids are depressed, when teachers are depressed, when people are stressed out, or exhibiting mental health problems, even if they're temporary, that takes time to recover from that. And those negative mental health problems foster negative behaviors. So I attribute a lot of the difficulties and the challenges that we're facing now, even after the pandemic, has a lot to do with the trauma that we were exposed to, and the fact that it really inhibited our community building from happening. Thank you.
Thank you.
So thank you all for attending this amazing lecture by Dr. Gustavo Carlo. And thank you to those of you who are online for engaging with UCI School of Education. We'll be posting the talk following this event. But we just want to thank you all for attending. We have lunch here for those that are in person. But we're just really grateful to Dr. Adriana Villavicencio and, of course, Dr. Gustavo Carlo. Thank you.